it's more or less correct, so I could read that out to you. So Professor Stefan Pas is a Dutch theologian and missiologist. He is director of the Centre for Church and Mission in the West and Professor of Missiology at the Theological University of Utrecht and the J.H. Bavinck Professor of Missiology and Public Theology at the Free University of Amsterdam. And he specialises in church planting in a post-Christian context. So, Stefan, it's fantastic that you're here with us tonight to give us this keynote lecture. And I think you're going to speak for, I don't know, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then there'll be a time for Q&A, hopefully, as well. So do come up and give your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. This morning at breakfast we had a discussion about how long a sermon could be, and I believe that most of you are used to sermons of 12, 15 minutes. I was raised a Calvinist, so it's really nothing. So 45 minutes, I hope I'll be finished then. We'll see. We'll see. No, no kidding. I think 45 minutes will be enough. Yeah, sure. There will be a recording there as well, I believe. Great. So, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I've been listening to conversations today about being a minority, trying to find its way into becoming a province, a diocese, a proto-province. Now, there was a bit of an awkward moment today at the gate of the cathedral, where the ministers didn't want to receive you. So, as it were, to rub in that you're a minority with not much power, influence, or institutional presence in this continent. Maybe it's good to start with a bright note that historically most of the innovation for the church in Europe has come from the minorities, from the margins. And some of these minorities were despised in their days. Honestly, some of them also gave some reasons to despise them. I mean, they're not all ideal, but still. Often the innovation comes from the margins. And I think it's a good point to start. So today, what I want to do is to look together with you to Europe. The title of my lecture is For a Time Like This, the missional momentum, the cultural momentum for mission in Europe. I was asked to give sort of a broad overview of Europe, which is almost impossible, obviously. The people from Croatia here, I'm from the Netherlands, the yellows from the Netherlands, the Americans, the Brits, whatnot, and we could also have invited Swedes and Italians and people from Spain, and all these countries have different stories, and also in terms of secularization and all that. But let's give it a try. Let's be bold. So, if you look at Europe on a very big canvas, the first thing you see is decline when it comes to church still. That's been ongoing for generations, since the Second World War, actually. Every new generation was less Christian than the previous one. And still the church is shrinking, it's aging in many countries. And like I said, Romania is not Sweden, but overall the forecast is not good from a human perspective. So maybe a good thing to point out here is that biblically, and in my last book, last English book I should say, I've written about exile, about being a minority, how the Bible actually is written by people who were almost always a minority without power. That the Bible is very clear, very adamant about that God does not abandon, that the fact that you don't have success does not mean that God has abandoned you. On the contrary, it may tell us, the Bible, that sometimes God is leading us precisely there where we do not have success, where our institutions crumble down, crumble away, where we bleed numbers and whatnot. That's all there in the Bible in times of exile. Sometimes I think that we, as Christians in contemporary Europe, have more in common with the writers of the Bible than with our own ancestors. And with that I mean that our ancestors lived in a Christian civilization, a very powerful Christianity. I'm talking about Europe here, but I think the same is true for the United States. So they basically ruled the country. They were dominant, often not in a good way. Let's be honest about that. Whereas the Bible writers were not at all dominant. Again, they were often a ridiculed minority. So that's one reason why I think that sometimes there's more resonance between us and the Bible writers than between us and our own ancestors, in a way. We can talk about it later, but important point to make, I think. We may be in a good place to read the Bible again, to learn to pray again, to learn to know what it is to trust God. That's the first observation. The second observation is very recently, we also see signs of a new interest in Christianity, especially in the most secular countries. Again, Europe is different, but especially in the most secular countries. 10 years ago it started, somewhere in Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, and especially among the youngest generation, what Americans call Gen Z. And nowadays everyone has calls them like that. So the generation born after 2000, people in the 20s basically. Justin Briley in his podcast, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, calls this a major missional moment. Let me give some examples for those who don't have the data. Just very quick. For example, the French Catholic Church recorded last year a new high in people who were candidates for baptism, in adult baptism, 12,000, 5,000 were young. About a third of this group was from outside the church. And no one thought that they could break this record, but this year with almost 18,000. And this is going up for 10 years already. Belgium, we see a similar trend. Finland, also an interesting case study. Finland, between 2012 and 2019, the number of young men going to church doubled. Interestingly enough, women didn't. So there's also a sort of gender gap. UK, recently a report, Quiet Revival, came out, which showed spectacular growth in faith and church going among Gen Z. Some figures have been contested, but the general trend hasn't been contested as far as I know. Netherlands, very recently, similar data came out that again, the youngest generation shows a new interest in religion and is actually more religious than the generation before them, which is really a reversal of a trend as far as we can tell. Of course, the jury is still out on how long this will take, how long this will last and all that, but it's going on for almost 10 years now, so we can't say that it is just a one-day phenomenon. There's more about it. For the first time maybe in history, in recent history, in our lifetimes, I would say, we see the youngest generation being more religious than the generation before. A quote from the Times, which had all major journals and newspapers are featuring issues on this phenomenon now. A quote, this is an article written by a millennial about this Gen Z. Jesus is making a comeback. And I don't mean that he has appeared again in the garden tomb. Among Generation Z, aged mid-teens to 28, religion is being resurrected. According to new research, they're half as likely as their middle-aged parents or boomer grandparents to identify as atheists. I, the writer of the article, I am a millennial, an irreligious generation, but for those who were in the classes below me, faith, religion and spirituality are on a different trajectory. As well as being the age group least likely to call themselves atheists, 62% of 18 to 24-year-olds identified as either very or fairly spiritual. In 2023, a third of them also said that they believe in the existence of God or a higher power, up from a quarter in 2021. This is about Britain, but the trends are basically quite similar. Now, some of Christian pundits and observers have used the term revival here. I'm always a bit careful there. Part of my problem with the word revival, even if it's quiet, is that we then try to see what is new through old lenses. The whole word revival, of course, was coined during the great revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries in what were then Christian societies. The masses of people grew a more personal, emotional faith, but they didn't become Christians. I mean, in a certain sense maybe, but they already believed in the Bible, believed in God, they prayed, they knew the catechism by heart and all that. But they were a religion of the heart, as it was called back then. And especially evangelicals and Pentecostals are always talking about the next great revival, but again, I'm not sure that that's the right lens to look at it. God is renewing his covenant, we learn from the Bible, which also may mean that we sometimes see things that are really new. And this is the first continent that has tried Christianity, rejected it, and maybe is returning to it. We'll see. Anyways, we're living in very different societies than in the 18th and 19th century. There's little to revive, I'd say. Theologically, I would always be careful to glorify the past or to reduce your mission to dreams of the next revival. God is always doing something. So what we see now is young people in thoroughly secularized societies turning to God, but not like their ancestors did. They are coming not as citizens of Christian societies, with the very Protestant questions that their Methodist and evangelical ancestors had in the 18th century. They are a multi-ethnic, spiritual, not very Christian, somewhat depressed and anxious generation, trying to find their way in the ancient religion of the continent. I'm not sure what it means yet. We'll see. But let's look at it a bit better. And I'd like to do this through three lenses. Often when we talk about Europe, we say it is secular. And as I already have explained, that's quite a complex thing. But if you look closer, secular is actually three things, three dimensions to it. Europe is increasingly post-Christendom, post-Christian, and post-modern. Post-Christendom, post-Christian, and post-modern. The word post obviously means after, Latin, but it's a very typical sort of after. C.S. Lewis once explained it by comparing to marriage. Someone who's divorced, who's separated, is in a very specific way after marriage. But it's a very different experience from never being married at all, if you get my point. So a post-Christian society is not a pre-Christian society or an un-Christian society. It has all the memories, good and bad, of Christianity, and there's all sorts of influences, scars sometimes, of this long period in European history. Anyways, let's begin with post-Christendom. What is Christendom? It's the translation of Latin Christianitas. Basically means Christian civilization, territory, very territorial also. The territories that were ruled by Christian kings, so governments were Christian, laws, institutions. If I try to explain to my students what this Christendom age was, how it feels, in many parts of the world still feels, I always say, well, compare it to democracy nowadays. So if you take, in my own country, if you take 100 Dutch people, and you ask them, do you support democracy? Do you believe in it? I think 99 out of 100 would say, yeah, sure. But then, would they vote? Would they come up for voting during election? Well, it depends on what election. National elections would be 80%, European elections would be 40%. So it depends how committed you are. But it's less than complete support. How many are members of a political party? In the Netherlands, 3%, 3 out of 100. And how many of them would know the names of all the ministers of the current administration? Or the last one? Or even 5 of them? With the right cabinet? If you would wake them up in the middle of the night. I think many of them would start sweating if you look at them and say, well, give me 5 names. So my point is basically, it's possible to have a system like Christianity or Christianity that is widely supported, where people know pretty little about it, are not extremely committed to it, but basically see it as well. This is basically who we are. We are Christians. I think in a long period of our history, it basically was like that, Christendom. What did that mean for evangelism, for Christian identity, for mission? Well, part of the Christendom experience was obviously that politics and Christianity were merged, which meant that in a way evangelism and mission, there was always a threat of force behind it, compel them to come in, as Augustine said, quoting from Luke. So there's always that, not just in terms of, let's say, complete oppression or force, but also in terms of more subtle, like social exclusion. A Portuguese friend of mine who was a Baptist said, my neighbours always tell me, you're not a real Portuguese, you're not Catholic. Oh, okay, get to hear that all the time. So there's sort of pressure. That's part of the Christian experience. There's also another element. To become a Christian in a Christian society is basically easier than not being a Christian. You have access to all the sources of culture. There's all sorts of package deals. For example, when the church is in control of poverty relief, education, unemployment checks, like in Brazil, that kind of stuff. And even today, that's sometimes the case. Some years ago, an Italian Protestant pastor in Rome, he told me it's virtually impossible in Rome to enroll your toddler in a childcare centre if you're not a member of the Catholic Church, because they're all run by the church. He's a Baptist minister. It's difficult. Such package deals make it difficult to not belong to the dominant church in a certain society. Now, post-Christendom simply means that we have arrived at a stage in our culture where most of these bonds between the church and secular power have been undone. There are traces of it here and there. We just pray for our gracious King, Charles, not my king, but still, I pray, why not? As the head of the church in the UK, right? There's Kirchensteuer, church tax in Germany, and so on. So here there's these traces, and of course it depends on where you are in Europe. Hungary is a different story than the Netherlands, obviously, but still. In many ways, we're after Christendom. So, what challenges does that pose for evangelism? Very briefly. First, I think it's important to see that we are now, by and large, living in a free market of religion. So, there's competition. And as a minority church, basically, you're benefiting from that. You're allowed to be on the market. The churches haven't burned down, closed, or whatever. There's no longer one monopolist, and forgive me the economic terms, but several suppliers competing with each other to draw customers, to draw clients. Meaning that people have something to choose. So one thing I think ensuing from that, following from that, is that you need to do the things you do with quality, with care. People can choose, you know. So all sorts of research show that, for example, the quality of preaching, the quality of pastoral care, unlike what many people believe, who glorify the past, has actually increased over the last century in many churches. Of course, we all know the heroes from the past, but they're not for nothing, they're called heroes. Many pastors could get away with pretty sloppy pastoral care and pretty sloppy preaching. Let me give just one example from the Netherlands, the northern province of Friesland. In the late 18th century, a letter was sent by the synod to all the ministers in this province that they should have a Bible in their home and they shouldn't preach while being drunk. You laugh, obviously, but apparently in the 18th century, not everybody would laugh. So yeah, my pastor does that, and he doesn't have a Bible in the house. So it just shows what you can get away with in a Christian society if you're paid anyway, if the government supports you, and if people have no choice, basically, then to go to you. So quality, important thing, and because there's no obligation, there's basically religious liberty. It's now possible to be a true citizen in full rights without ever attending a church. So the church is less threatening. There isn't, I think, a bright side to that. And I'll come back to that when I look at the Gen Z conversions, but I think for many of them, the church is no longer a threatening thing like for their grandparents, for example. Anyways, churches can no longer expect that people will come anyway. People will not go to church to enhance their social standing, to further their career, to find a spouse, to get money, to have an ecstatic experience, or to please their parents. All this can be found outside the church, and usually with fewer strings attached. Today, people will only join the Christian community if they can find something there that cannot be found anywhere else. So, this is the big question. A post-Christendom situation makes us focus on this one question. What is our unique selling point? Or to turn the question around, what is it that people look for if they come to church at all? What is it that they can find nowhere else? Our post-Christendom age leads us to a passionate commitment to the unique core of our Christian faith. This is the single most important question that you must answer. What is it that my neighbours can only find in the Christian community and nowhere else? And as simple as the answer may be, it's often not taken seriously enough. And I think it's a crucial question when we look at the current vibe shift among younger Europeans. Some of the conversions we see today are driven by longing for Christian culture, or to save Western civilization. There is a clear conservative drive as well. Some of this may be inspired by Tom Holland's recent book, Dominion, where he argued that the West is essentially a Christian culture, and that today's culture wars must be understood as a conflict between different Christian moral instincts. For example, caring for the poor, that's taken more left-wing, and for strangers, versus protecting the family or protecting traditional communities, more conservative. But both actually Christian instincts, he says. An example may be Ayaan Hirsi Ali's recent conversion to Christianity. For those who don't know her, Hirsi Ali is a Somalian-born immigrant who became a high-profile atheist and a zealous critic of Islam after she became a citizen in the Netherlands years ago. She became personal friends with people like Richard Dawkins, and she became a sort of hero of the new atheist movement. Later she moved to the USA, where she wrote pieces against Islam, and increasingly against what she sees as the woke left. Last year she published an article, Why I Am Now a Christian. And she wrote that atheism doesn't have the spiritual resources to fight Islam and wokeism. For that we need Christianity. Not sure how happy that makes you. Some people need Christianity as a weapon. And I'm thinking here of Bonhoeffer, who once said that we shouldn't confuse Christian with Christ with Christian culture. We shouldn't confuse Christ with Christian culture. A Christian conversion is not a conversion to Christianity or to some form of idealized, fossilized Christian culture. Christianity is not a museum. No, Christian conversion is a conversion to Christ. Without Christ, so-called Christian culture is like flowers in a vase. They look nice for a while, but then they wither and die. Christian culture without Christ is like an object in a museum. But we're not called to worship objects in a museum, but to worship the living Christ, who renews culture every generation, and who often creates awkward moments for Christians, for his own followers. Read the book of Acts, for example. Fortunately, Hirsi Ali also wrote about spiritual experiences that triggered her conversion, and she tells us that she goes to church now and that she's learning about Christ. So it's not all cultural war by religious means, and I'm happy to hear that. And also, I think Christendom keeps playing a role in these modern conversions. Many converts, for example, have profited from Christian schools in their childhood. Or they see great Christian art, or listen to Bach, and start wondering. It seems that in France, for example, the burning of the great Cathedral Notre Dame has triggered a new interest among young people for a religion that created such beauty. These people back there, those religious people, our ancestors, may not have been fools after all, if they could build something like that. I don't think nostalgia should be the main reason to become a Christian, but in Christianity there is something that may appeal to such nostalgia. The longing for a different world, a world without end. Many young people are suffering from isolation, individualism, loneliness. As one new convert told the Times journalist, and I quote, Christianity counteracts individualism. A lot of people live their life thinking you're on your own. You do what makes you happy. But we're designed to be connected and live for and with other people. Community is essential. I believe we're here for a reason bigger than just looking after yourself. Unquote. So, let's keep our eyes open. Conversion is not about becoming a culture warrior, but conversion may be triggered by a certain critique of modernity, or of a society that has lost its traditions. And love for Christ may grow where people start to think about themselves as heirs of a great tradition. Post-Christendom may mean that there are still a lot of treasures available from tradition, but a church is not as threatening and suffocating anymore as it once used to be, and had the power to control culture. And that may open the door towards a new relationship with the church. That's my first lens, post-Christendom. Let's go to the second. Post-Christian. About winning souls and hearts. So, post-Christendom, as I explained, does not necessarily mean that people quit going to church. But it just says that people are free to go. They don't have to. They don't gain anything by doing it. So it means that in a post-Christendom situation, I've experienced that in Amsterdam, for example, when I preached there, usually the group was not very big, like 70, 80 people. But and they were all in their 20s and 30s. But I knew one thing for sure, they were there because they wanted to be there. Not because their parents had told them to go, or because they didn't want to disappoint their grandparents or whatever. They wanted to be there. So people who are still going to church in our society are very committed usually. After all, you don't have to go. So it's very well possible that many people will still attend church in a post-Christendom situation, but people do it for different reasons now. I think that's an important thing to say. Not because they feel obliged, but to invest in themselves, for example, to develop their spirituality, or to have a good time, or to find community, to explore certain spiritual experiences. You can see that in the United States, where this culture, I think, is more advanced already. There are many people are attracted to Christianity, even if they don't have to. Somehow it's still the normal thing to do, even in a post-Christian separation of church and state and that all. But still, it's in the air. It's still the thing to do, at least in the South, Midwest. But in more post-Christian societies, like many Western European societies, it's not just true that people are free to be Christians now. Christianity itself has become quite incredible for many people in our culture, or unattractive. And that's what I mean with a post-Christian age. We live in an age with strong cultural objections against Christianity. Christianity is against science, as we all know. It's uncool, or even dangerous. And look at all those wars, people say. Look at Gaza and Israel today. If it weren't for religion. I've met quite a few people who said, without religion, this conflict wouldn't exist. Post-Christian means that the Christian story has lost its prestige, its authority. It's still out there in fragments, hints, intuitions, free-floating elements, so people can use it in whatever way they want. Think of the drag queen version of the Last Supper during the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in Paris. The Christian story is just one of many stories, and we can do with it what we want. It's not sacred anymore. And of course, a post-Christian culture does not know the Christian story, since most people do not have the opportunity to become familiar with it. Like at schools, for example, if you don't go to church or Sunday school, where do you learn the Christian story anyway? Hollywood? Stuart Murray tells this little story in one of his books, quote, "In a London school, a teenager with no church connections hears the Christmas story for the first time. His teacher tells it well, but he's fascinated by this amazing story. Risking his friend's mockery, after a lesson, he thanks her for the story. One thing had disturbed him, so he asks, why did they give the baby a swear word for his name?" Yeah. So, I'm sure you can add many similar stories. So, I can. So, a post-Christian society, by and large, means this. There's a small group of committed Christians, people who are Christians because they want, and not because they must. A similarly small group of committed unbelievers, people who find religion ridiculous or dangerous. And a large group in the middle, that is pressured from both sides, but usually does not find Christianity all that credible, even though they may sympathize with some elements of it. And why did this happen? There's a host of reasons, obviously. The rationality of the modern world. We have created a world where we no longer feel threatened by dark forces and evil magic. We've isolated ourselves against this by clear thinking. We can be successful in our daily lives without religion. Charles Taylor describes this as the immanent frame. Modern life is increasingly a life under human control. And that is not just a rational argument, it's basically sort of feeling. We don't feel as vulnerable as our ancestors usually. If you think 5 minutes about all the misery our ancestors had to live through in terms of average life expectation, children who died very young, wars, famine, epidemics. Our lives are very, very different. Moreover, many people believe that religion, at least strong religion, is dangerous. It stirs up many passions. It turns us away from the common human good. And this makes us an enemy of ordinary human desires, like friendship, sex, entertainment, work. And then there's, of course, the scandals. Time and again, think of child abuse in the Roman Catholic Church, abusive pastors in Protestant mega churches. It's a very sad story, and I don't want to go into detail, but we all know what we mean. So I'm not saying that all this is completely thought out and argued. If you speak to an average person on the street, that he or she has a whole list of arguments, philosophical, why God doesn't exist and all that. No, it's more like a cultural mood. Or as Taylor says, a cultural spin that leads so many Europeans to thinking that science has disproved God, or that religion is a danger for society. Everyone knows that. You don't even have to argue for that. I mean, basically, it's true, isn't it? It's a picture that holds us captive, as Wittgenstein would say. A cultural narrative that is made attractive rather than convincing. It's not that many people have come to believe this through arguments. It's basically something they want to believe. It's attractive. You can hear it when people say, we can't turn back the clock, can we? Or, you don't want to go back to the Middle Ages, right? Or to the 1950s, which seems to have been a horrible time, if I may believe the journalists. You don't want to go back to the 50s, do you? Now, I think there's something involved here, to make this a more serious argument. There's something involved here that you might call maturity. To be non-religious, at least until recently, in our culture is promoted as being mature. You're autonomous. You can fend for yourself. To be religious, by contrast, means to be infantile. It means that we're not mature enough to take life as it is. To grow up means that we say goodbye to Santa Claus and God. If you read books, for example, from Richard Dawkins, but also other new atheists, this is their big story. That's a good, yeah, we know, the majority of people are religious, of course. You know, the majority of people are not very mature. There's only a very small minority of people who really take life as it is, who are not afraid to face life without God. This, says Taylor, is the kind of spin that closes the imminent frame for transcendence. Science has not disproved God. That's nonsense. And religion is not any more dangerous than a secular worldview. But many people want to believe that because it resonates with the deep longing in our hearts to be grown up, brave, and authentic. That may be even more attractive to men than to women, by the way. Some research suggests that. Religion is for all people, for sick people, for women, and for children. This is why parents expect their children to grow out of religious feelings when they grow up, at least in Amsterdam. It's okay for a child to believe in Jesus, but come on, you're 17 now. And this is why most adults are not attracted to serious religion, even if they want to experiment with spirituality now and then. Moreover, since there is always an element, I think that's important to say, there's always an element of immaturity and projection in our own faith. So this criticism also appeals to many believers, making them insecure, and thus eroding their missionary zeal. Because we're human, so we do project now and then. We do have these childish desires. So what does evangelism mean in a post-Christian society? What kind of specific challenges does post-Christianity pose? Well, obviously we need apologetics, clever arguments, sound theology, and all that. I think that's solid. But all of that will not help if we do not understand why people find criticisms against Christianity attractive in the first place. Because we're not computers, right? We don't believe the things we do because we have a long series of arguments, and at the end we think, well, there's a 73% chance that God exists, so let me believe that God exists, or not. That's not the way it works. So all of us, I think, have been in situations where you brought up your best arguments, and then the other person just shrugged his shoulders. And the other person was just as frustrated as you were, because he or she, well, it was his or her best argument, and you thought, it's really? Is that all? And that's because we're not that rational. So there's a lot, we believe, in the end, what we want to believe. So part of our evangelistic mission in the West must be to unravel these deep cultural narratives of autonomy and heroism. Our main missionary and educational problem may be not that we don't have any good arguments, but that we don't have a widely appealing vision of what it means to be a religious adult, a mature person. And if I may add, to be an adult, mature man. I'll get back to that. I'm sorry, ladies, but there is also this kind of gender stuff in this. I meet a lot of young guys who are really at a loss there. So only if people start to believe that a Christian life is an adventurous life, only fit for the brave, will they be prepared to look at arguments defending it. And if you're really followers of Jesus, we're disciples of the most mature man that has ever lived. Christianity is not about good people who get rewarded and about being punished. All those childish dreams. It's not about escaping reality and cozy religious parties. It is about following a man who was ultimately good, who was deeply loved by his Father, and yet was called to suffering and death, because he loved his people, and he hated the powers that enslaved them. If that is not adventurous and brave, I do not know what is. So the best apologetic in a post-Christian culture is to have a provocative church, a church that means business and following Jesus. Now, of course, a truly post-Christian society is a bit of an experiment. Is it really thinkable? A society without religion? For a while we thought it was, but the current conversions among Gen Z may show that human beings are intrinsically religious. You can't suppress that forever. We're always looking for meaning, and this society of technology and consumption does not give enough of that, apparently. Several factors there. The first one, the boomer generation is dying out with its problematic relationship with religion. Many people who slammed the door of the church behind them, closed the door of the church behind them and they left, are basically old. They no longer have a strong grip on society, do not dominate social parties anymore, or are basically dying. Gen Z grew up in a deeply secular society, but a society with remarkably few frustrations about Christianity, because those memories are basically gone. Someone from East Germany, where this is going on much longer, actually since the 19th century, once said to me that a teenager who wants to rebel against her parents in East Germany goes to church. Today, church is increasingly an alternative lifestyle, a countercultural thing, especially churches full of smells and bells, esoteric languages like Latin and Aramaic, and centuries-old traditions. I heard about some very traditional Catholic churches where young Gen Z women wear veils. That is something for a rebellious statement today. Nothing is better to annoy your parents, right? Gen Z also testifies about a lot of anxieties. So there's a lack of general, there's a lack of structure and meaning. You're free to do whatever you want, like some people in Amsterdam told me, young people. So, you know, I'm completely free, but the problem is no one cares. Then I already said there's problems with masculinity, young men telling me, yeah, I hear a lot about toxic masculinity, and I see the reasons for that. I mean, yeah, there are problems. But is there anything good to say about being a man? Where can I learn, where can I see role models? Where can I learn something about that? There's loneliness. Jonathan Haidt, for example, in several of his studies, has shown that especially young people who have grown up with social media, so-called social media, become very lonely, actually. So there's a quote from an influencer, Emily Beanie, who says, "We're always called the hopeless generation. We're dealing with so many mental health problems, and online culture has fueled comparison on another level. We're constantly comparing. It's driving people to burn out. I think once they hit that place of, I have tried and I'm still not good enough, that's when people are turning to Christianity. And I think that especially since the COVID epidemic, that online media have also played a massive role. We see influencers like Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand, advertising religion, taking the Bible very serious. In a recent study among young French Catholic converts, 78% indicated that social media are crucial for their conversion. 78%. That's unheard of. 84% are following Catholic influence. And apparently Christians, or the church in general, have been very successful in invading the world of social media. Maybe that was something they learned during COVID. Not sure. There's a whole new mission field out there. Speaking for myself, we started a podcast 6 years ago, conversations about the faith and all sorts of cultural issues. And by now we reach an average of 300,000 listeners per month. That's in the Netherlands, it's in Dutch. It's almost all now. There are 18 million Dutch people, so we have something a while to go. Let's go. So to wrap this up, I think all this is very encouraging, especially the degree to which new forms and methods of evangelism are breaking through, the enormous amount of very high quality substance that is now available on the internet via podcasts or YouTube, but there's a lot of words as well, but there's really good stuff to be found there. Evangelism today, I think it's an important thing to make, the point to make. James Butler makes that, for example. Evangelism today is less about proclamation and more about conversation. So young people don't want to be lectured. They like good input and discussion about it. Butler claims that this is actually the way evangelism always went. In the early church, people just gossiped it. They talked about it together. Of course, you need some input. You need good sermons, good books and all that. But still, that is not doing the job. The job is done when people are starting to talk about it and sharing it and discussions about it. So the most important challenge made today may not be evangelism, actually, but maybe discipling these new converts. How to grow them into mature Christians. It's too early to tell, but signs are promising. Finally, last lens, the postmodern take on our culture. Now, first of all, postmodern is a very fuzzy term. An Urban Dictionary writes, doesn't mean anything. Use as often as possible. But let's try to unpack it a little. Yeah. First of all, I think our societies have become deeply pluralistic. So the postmodern experiences have something to do with the deep pluralism of our societies. There's no single story that gives meaning to our culture. As a consequence, people encounter different life views every day, not just in books, but in people who are just like them. That's the point. Maybe your own brother, friends. People are just as smart, as nice, as kind as you. And still, they believe very different things. So whatever seemed natural once appears to be merely one choice among many others. Our life choices are always unstable, optional, changeable, once you come to think about it. The postmodern experience. Second, as postmoderns, we are deeply convinced that there's no institution, no story, no program that we can trust blindly. So for postmoderns, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to believe anything with the same innocence as our ancestors. Things are never just because they are, or because the priest tells us so, because the Bible tells us so. But that's important to say. Let's say more conservative Christians often wrestle with postmodernism because they think it leads to nihilism, to not believing anything, or complete relativism. Of course, that happens as well, but for most people it doesn't. What I see, for example, in a very postmodern city like Amsterdam, actually people do believe in all sorts of things, and they are committed to all sorts of causes, but not too strong. Or they do it with a smile. Ah, that's me. Something like that. I call it ironic commitments. And don't mistake the word. Don't think that the word ironic means not serious. There's always, you know that it's not that stable in a way. If people ask you why are you doing this, you can give some answers, but in the end you say, well, this is just who I am. You know. So we may be prepared to commit ourselves to certain courses, but not without caution and only for the time being. And always with some reserve. That's postmodern. Part of the life experience of postmoderns is that we no longer receive our identities from the outside. Parents, family, church, nation. But we rather construct them by looking inside. Because that's the only resource we have left. So we look at our true selves, deep inside. Our age is an age of authenticity. What does your heart tell you? Trying to find out who you really are. And in this context, people tend to see religion as a path of personal development, and no longer as something you belong to. There's a very deep felt conviction in all this that you are the only one who can find out your identity. No one else can do this for you, nor should anyone try. Now, for evangelism, in our society, this means that we need places where people can explore Christianity without being trapped by it. In the church in Amsterdam that I've pastored for years, we found out time and again how important that is. All the new people who became a member in our church said the same. The most important thing for me was that you allowed me to doubt, to ask every question, and voice every criticism without making you scared of me. And there were many more people at links with our church, through home groups or social events, who would not become a member, at least not immediately, but they valued very much that we held them lightly. The church must be a safe place for seekers and doubters. We often say that, but it's very difficult to really do it where people are so different sometimes. It's not because we're uncertain about what we believe and why we follow Jesus. On the contrary, it's because we're certain enough to be a solid other for those people. So, to be a place where people can explore and can doubt and can answer all sorts of critical questions doesn't mean that you say, I agree with you, and yeah, no, you can be yourself, I can be myself. And that's where we meet. So the pluralism and instability of postmodernism also opens us up to find new paths to truth, more embodied, intuitive, mystical perhaps. Church Father Augustine said, we are not rational beings. I just mentioned it. We're beings who are driven by love. So why are you a Christian? Why do you have the political views you have? Why do you have the commitments that you have? All by reasoning, all by being convinced by arguments. Oh, maybe arguments involved. I'm not saying that we don't think. But usually it begins somewhere else. It begins with love, being touched somehow. We fall in love through beauty, through role models, authenticity, narratives, stories. Some decades ago, many churches looked for relevance. Relevance in terms of a modern, rational, consumerist society. Actually, John Howard Yoder pointed out somewhere, evangelicals and liberals had a lot in common. It was all about being relevant. In different ways, but still, very modern in that way. They wanted to be relevant, first and foremost. So they tried marketing techniques, they introduced modern music, sometimes just as good, but often just a little bit worse than what the world has to offer. They dumbed down their messages to self-help advice with some Bible text and so on. It's a bit of a caricature, but keep in mind. Postmodern people, though, aren't looking for seeker churches where they can find everything that the world has in supply, from progressive or conservative politics to guitars, only in better quality and with fewer strings attached. They look for the real thing, vintage religion, stained glass, clerical colours, language of sin and grace. They look for authentic, somewhat otherworldly religion. Or to quote Tom Holland again in a podcast recently, he said, they're looking for a religion that is weird. He meant supernatural in a way. And he mentioned specifically the Pentecostals and the Roman Catholics. Apparently they were weird, according to Tom Holland. But he meant it as a compliment. So, of course, this must be done in a way that we don't repeat the sins of the past. The sins of arrogance, authoritarianism, constant judgment, or infighting. We must look at our own strengths. The discussion we had this morning. We have to look at our own strength, not as proof that we are, after all, the only true church, but as gifts that we can offer to the wider church. And also we may need to rethink some of the self-evident focus on, let's say, family values, traditional gender relations, etc. Not necessarily to change our views, but to become more sensitive. Most of the new generation, especially young women, are very wary of churches that simply repeat patriarchal structures, or that ostracize queer people. Gen Z is, all research shows that, Gen Z is less sexually active, generally more critical of alcohol than previous generations. So maybe that's not the battle we have to fight there. But it's also true that about 10% of the 16 to 24-year-old identify as gay. And gender equality is self-evident to most of them. To quote Emily Beanie again, I don't think God can make mistakes. I don't think anyone is a mistake, or anyone gender is a mistake. If people come to our doors and they're gay, I want them to come straight in and be welcome. Unquote. Now, you don't have to agree with our viewpoints, but definitely there's a point there. Churches need to be sensitive about it. There's definitely a hunger for churches that don't oversimplify, that present Christianity also through beauty and tradition and firm ethical demands. After all, we are bodies, and probably conversion does not begin in our heads, but in our guts. And that also means that we are sensitive to the issues that are very important to already quite anxious young people. But we need churches that go to the gut and take it from there. To wrap it up, what are the conditions for evangelism in our age? I think I mentioned 5. Focus on our core business. What is it that makes us unique? What is our real commitment in this world of marketing? Second, developing adventurous discipleship. Picture what it means to be a mature person as a Christian. We need to produce good theology and apologetics. We need to allow for uncertainty and question spirituality. We need to develop spiritual direction and mystagogy for a new generation. Thank you. That's 50 minutes.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you for beginning with those encouragements about how we might feel that we're a minority, but we can identify with the biblical writers who were also minority. The encouragement about the quiet revival, or what that might mean, or the vibe shift amongst Generation Z, and then this analysis about Europe being post-Christendom, post-Christian, and post-modern, and all that means for evangelism in terms of focusing on our unique selling point, creating this widely appealing vision of being a mature adult, and exploring, creating places where people can explore Christianity without feeling trapped by it. So thank you for all that you've shared there. And there's now an opportunity for questions, maybe about 15 minutes.
So thank you, Stefan. That was excellent. Well, we kind of had a quick discussion this morning, but I want the role, the importance, your gut instincts on the necessity and the advantage, let's say, for lack of a better word, of a rich sacramentality, a tradition both of sacramental life, but an understanding of sacrament.
Yeah. So, and this is basically a bit black and white, the way I picture it now. Let's say the tradition I grew up in of Protestantism, of some forms of Protestantism, actually I come from a good pietistic tradition, not as bad as in some forms. It's pretty rational. Maybe that's not the way it's phrased, but so the implicit concept of how people come to faith is by a lot of argument, a lot of discursive preaching, showing why it's true. Now, again, this is black and white. It's not for all Protestants. And you can see it in the church buildings. They're actually lecture rooms. There's a pulpit there, pews there, so you can't be distracted. Churches where I grew up in were white, no pictures on the walls, no stained glass. We knew what it was all about, the big Bible on the pulpit. There's beauty in that as well. And there's a lot, of course, of sub-rational elements, the way the preacher preached, the relationships in the church. So there's always more than what the eye sees. But anyway, you could argue that human beings have never been like that. So that even in the most rational parts of Protestantism, there's always been the more sub-rational, what people brought to faith in real life, rather than basically just being a head that's transported by a body. But I think recently, think of the work of James Smith, for example, and others, who have reflected on what postmodernism means for Christianity, for the church. Now, like I already said, postmodernism is a very fuzzy term. It is often used very polemically. But if you just try to use it more analytically, you can say it's at the very least it is a sort of undermining of the sort of modern idea that we're rational beings, and that's that, and that it's all about argument. And I think James Smith is very helpful there when he explains that in terms of pedagogy, which is the way we as human beings are brought to Christ, or incorporated in the church, or initiated in the faith, is very much a business of love, of forming and shaping love. That's a very Augustinian approach, obviously, but Augustine was often right. I think, yeah. Now, which brings us, I think, to the point, theologically, that we start to think, how is love formed? How is it shaped? Intellectual argument can play a role there. Speaking for myself, I love a good argument. It does much more than convince me. There's beauty, harmony in it. Like some people find harmony and beauty in mathematics. Not me, I'm a language person, but I can understand why some people have that. My daughter, for example. She can have tears in her eyes as she sees a beautiful mathematical sum or reasoning. Okay. So, sacramentality, beauty, the aesthetic elements of faith, the embodied elements of faith, I think are all very crucial there. And I think the conversation we had this morning was that you'll find that in the more liturgical churches, obviously, like your own church. Pentecostals have a different way, but it's also actually very sacramental churches. It's a lot about music, about embodiment, dancing, using your body in different ways. And of course, let's say preaching and argument plays a role, but it's much more than that. So it's all about shaping love. Yeah. Now, of course, you can also go deeper into the theology of sacramental and what embodiment means in theology. In one of my latest books, which is in Dutch, unfortunately, it's a language of heaven, but unfortunately, many people don't speak it here yet. I say embodiment, or the fact that we have bodies, I think means three things. We're always contextual, we're localized. You can be through your body, you can be at one place at a time, grow up in one place, learn one language, maybe two, learn one cultural repertoire, maybe two. You're connected through your body. You feel the wind on your skin, the air move, the touch of other people, their voice reaches your eardrums and all that. So there's all that. Even sitting upright changes your mood, for example. All that kind of stuff. So we're bodies. And then there's this part of the body, which does a lot more than this part. So I think that's one of the elements I explained, that we believe in a way what we want to believe, or what our body tells us to believe, in a very deep way. Anyway, so there's I think sacraments, or the sacramental view of reality, is very important to as a theological tool to understand that. Yeah. How the flesh can be spiritual at the same time, stuff like that. Long answer, sorry. I'm a Calvinist.
It's very interesting that you said that Gen Z, they like traditional stuff, right?
Many of them do, yeah.
Yeah, especially men, young men, right?
Yeah.
So they love traditional church, they love the liturgy, they love sacraments. But the generations prior to them, they were more liberal, more postmodern, if you want to say that. And if you look, let's call it temporally, like a time scale,
Yeah.
right? We can see that trends are changing. So currently, yes, my way of doing Christianity is modern.
Yes.
And that's
Old
why
fashioned man.
and we are cool guys currently with Gen Z, right? Okay.
Definitely.
But maybe in 10 years, there's going to be Gen X, Y, P.
Alpha.
No. Oh yeah, it's Alpha. Yeah, I heard of that. Thank you. Yeah, it's Gen Alpha, and if that changes, what will happen with our traditional liturgical churches?
Yeah.
What do you think? What will happen? I mean, a lot of us will get depressed, maybe sad, but
Very
again,
likely it will happen.
yeah, that's
Because
why.
that's the way history works.
That's why I think our focus should be on the gospel and preaching in general context and not just looking at trends. I mean, trends have not helped me in any way, to be honest, but I do respect, of course, the research our theologians are doing in
Yeah. But you're giving a good conservative response. I don't care about trends. I'm just doing what I always did, and I'll always do that. And let the trends look after themselves. Great, good answer. Yeah, if you would be very concerned about trends, you probably wouldn't wear the dress you're wearing and the color, and you wouldn't be in a different church.
I have an Iron Maiden shirt under my cassock, so I'm an old school.
That's too much information. Thank you. But you get my, I mean, this, so to give a serious answer to that, yeah, I think the pendulum shifts. That's something I think Christians always need to understand. I think it was again Augustine who said, there will always be a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. Which is a very good way to capture this. Sometimes the wind is in your back and sometimes it's not. But in this particular moment, I think, we should try to understand, try to be open to the fact that there's a whole generation right now where large groups are really hungry and pretty anxious and feel a bit without a rudder or without steering wheel, how do you call it, without guidance. So, and they're not all of them, but those who convert often come to churches like your church. Yes? Now, why is that? Of course, you can say, and you probably will say that, because I just tell the gospel. I've always done that, but then, of course, the question could be, why didn't they come 10 years ago? So there is something going on there. And of course, I'm talking as an academic here, but also as a Christian. I want to understand what the Spirit is doing nowadays. Yeah, but I would really want to encourage you, just keep doing what you do.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because I think that this morning I told an allegory about throwing nets on the other side of the boat, right? So now it's our time, finally. Not Pentecostal time or Baptist time. Finally we can throw our nets on the
you're
other
cool
side.
again.
Yeah. so let's catch some fish, you know.
Yeah, but of course, let's face it, you're also different than your ancestors 100 years ago. Yes, maybe with the same robes and all that, but they didn't wear Iron Maiden shirts under it. They were thinking that was a deadly sin. So the fact that you're doing that already shows that you're someone of this generation. You can combine things, sort of patchwork kind of thing. I don't want to go too deep into that, but it's also a postmodern thing. Anyways, good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Our ancestors, you were talking about the goats, but they do say the goat is a second brain. And our ancestors had a different microbiome, and there's a lot of things coming out now about the microbiome, which I'm very interested in. So
I don't know anything about that.
it's fascinating because there are new species of microbiome that are actually helping you, for example, antibiotics is one thing that's taken one species away from the gut, and it's bringing back a lot of health benefits for people. And so this, it's exciting, there are exciting things happening, but we are not necessarily, it's not being viewed in the media, say.
No, definitely no. There's a lot going on. I mean,
it's very interesting.
I didn't check it for myself, but someone who knows these things told me that our total amount of knowledge doubles every week, whereas around 1800 it doubled every century or something like that. So it's baffling.
Of course, just a comment.
Not my
The
knowledge.
funny thing is we know more and more about less and less.
Yeah, we know nothing about anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. But I think one of the points that might be made in context of this is there is, of course, in Christianity a sort of deep sense that human beings in all times and all cultures are essentially the same, images of God and all that. At the same time, as a missiologist, I always warn my students, but culturally they are very different. Try to tell a Dutch joke to someone from Japan or vice versa, and you'll see what happens. I won't even try it here. And we are culturally probably much closer. All that, and that's a very innocent example. But if you think of our ancestors, the theology of our ancestors, the theology we got from them, think what it means to have an average life expectation of 35. Think what it means. In the Roman Empire, 2nd century, one in every 50 boys got to his 50th year of life. I'm 55, should have been dead. And only one in every 100 girls. What it meant to be pregnant and to get a baby, 17% chance of mortality, every pregnancy. Think of epidemics like the Black Death. So I'm just, recently I studied the life of John Owen, a Puritan. How many children did he have? 10, I believe. 9 died before they were 5 years old. There's only one who got to 18 years, she married and then died, tuberculosis. So what does that do to your theology? Just one. So yeah, people do change. We are different. I think our emotional life is in a sense, I'm not saying that we couldn't understand our ancestors at all, but our emotional lives have become different. We are much more sensitized against violence, for example, against death, against all these issues that were. Our ancestors took their children to a public execution just to teach them a lesson. That would be an X-rated film today. I'm not completely irresponsible. So I mean, just make the point that in terms of hierarchy, of violence, of vulnerability, all that, our times have changed really, and we're getting generations now who have become very, very sensitive against every form of violence or authoritarianism or whatever. So there's a way in which our culture, we have to relearn a lot of things and to find out how theology works in a culture that has become so averse against any form of violence or authority, which is in itself maybe it's a fruit of the gospel. I'm just still struggling with it. But anyway, I'm not sure why I mentioned it, but people do change, that's my point. Yeah, we're different.
So before you mentioned that as a Generation Z myself, it's an interesting conversation. I have personally noticed an overwhelming movement of younger men to a more orthodox and traditional form of Christianity. But then, counter to that, I've noticed the overwhelming number of women have moved actually to a far more liberal and
or leave the church at all.
It's an interesting thing, but how do we navigate this future in the Christian church so that we can, instead of becoming the water that is neither hot nor cool, instead we can appeal to both demographics to a potent level?
It's a conversation I'm having nowadays a lot with my students. They're all in their 20s, all Gen Z. Actually, quite a few converts among them as well, because that's what we see in the Netherlands at least. More and more theology students actually come from non-religious homes. We don't have the answers yet, but it's very strange. For the first time in history, maybe, is that young men are more religious than young women. Never happened before. Never happened before. In all cultures, in all ages, as far as we can tell, women are always more religious. Have always been. So, I'm not saying that the trend is completely beyond the women. I mean, young women come to faith as well, but far less so than young men. So it may have to do, so if you look in general culture, so let's say apart from religion, what you see is that in terms of conservatism and all that, also young men are generally more conservative. But if you speak with researchers, my colleagues, sociologists at the university, say, well, the point is the women have changed, the young men not so much actually. They're pretty much at the same values as their fathers and their grandfathers had when they were young. The young women have become far more liberal and progressive. May have to do with entering the job market. We don't know. It's still a bit of a guess. When I speak to my female students, some of them Roman Catholic, for example, I always ask them this question. So how do you deal, for example, with the fact that you study theology, but you can't become a priest? And usually they give answers like, well, I like it that there is a place where there are no political discussions. So in church we just worship Jesus. Now they're 20, maybe if you're looking for a job when you're 25, you rethink those things, I'm not sure. But so many of them just put a wall between. Some of the students would say, female students, say, well, women do not necessarily go to church when they become religious, because women are much more social than men. So they have friends and social media. So they have home groups and all that, and you don't see them as often in church, but because they have their own ways to organize themselves. That may be true as well. But wouldn't surprise me actually. But yeah, there is definitely a difference in gender. And maybe the explanation is very simple, in the sense that when you look at influences on social media, that become very, very important. There have been some very influential male influences like Jordan Peterson, who's had a huge influence on many young men, and I think far less so on young women. So that may explain something of it. But there are female influences as well, also committed Christians who are telling about their conversion, so it doesn't explain everything, but many of these male influences also push very much on discipline your life, clean your room, that's right, that way now. So that may dovetail with sort of looking for a more disciplined life that is a bit under control, rather than just gaming in your room, all that. But, you know.
Stefan, thank you very much indeed. If there are any more burning questions, do catch Stefan as we tidy up. But thank you for being with us today. You've made a real sacrifice, I know, to be with us. Thank you for everything you gave to us in our group work earlier on, the way you guided that. Thank you for such a rich lecture characterising the state of Europe now and what that means for evangelism. So we thank you very much indeed. This is a gift from all of us for you to enjoy. So it comes with our thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If there are any more burning questions, do catch Stefan as we tidy up. I'll tidy up these booklets and so on. Dinner for the conference delegates is at 8 o'clock at the hotel.
Okay.
So do start sort of making your way there. But it's 8 o'clock in the place itself.
Yeah.